The evening sky had turned a deep purple as Officer James Reynolds checked his watch. Just 30 more minutes until his shift ended. His feet ached in his boots and thoughts of his couch, a cold drink, and the baseball game waiting at home floated through his mind. It had been a quiet Thursday in the small town of Riverdale, the kind of uneventful day most officers secretly hoped for. The radio on his belt crackled to life, cutting through the peaceful hum of the patrol car's engine. Unit 14, we have a call about strange noises at the old Miller factory on Oak Street. Caller reports hearing what sounds like crying or whimpering for the past couple days. Can you check it out? Reynolds sighed and reached for the radio. Copy that, dispatch. On my way. So much for ending his shift on time. He glanced at his partner, Officer Tom Daniels, who was already tapping their destination into the GPS, though they both knew where the abandoned building stood. What do you think? Daniels asked, his young face showing the eagerness of someone just 2 years on the force. Probably kids messing around, right? Reynolds shrugged. Or maybe a stray dog got trapped inside. Wouldn't be the first time. He turned the car around and headed toward the older part of town, where many of the buildings from Riverdale's once thriving industrial days still stood empty. The Miller textile factory had been closed for nearly 10 years now, its windows boarded up and its brick walls covered with graffiti. The property had been tied up in some legal battle between heirs who couldn't decide whether to sell or renovate. Meanwhile, it just sat there, slowly falling apart, occasionally attracting curious teenagers or homeless folks looking for shelter. As Reynolds pulled up across the street, he noticed an older woman standing on her porch, arms crossed. Mrs. Chen had lived in that house for as long as anyone could remember. She waved when she saw the patrol car. That's probably our caller, Daniel said, and Reynolds nodded in agreement. They'd approached her, and before they could even introduce themselves, she started talking. I've been hearing it for 3 nights now, she said, pointing toward the factory. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it's not. It sounds like someone crying, not loud but steady, like they're hurt or scared. Did you see anyone go in there? Reynolds asked, pulling out his notepad. Mrs. Chen shook her head. No, but I don't watch it all day. I called because it doesn't sound right. It's not kids playing around. It sounds desperate. Something in her tone made Reynolds straighten up. He'd learned over his 20 years wearing the badge that sometimes the difference between routine and emergency came down to a feeling, an instinct that couldn't quite be put into words. We'll check it out thoroughly, he promised. As they approached the building, flashlights in hand, the fading daylight cast long shadows across the cracked parking lot. Weeds pushed up through the pavement, and old fast food wrappers tumbled by in the light breeze. I don't hear anything, Daniels whispered as they reached the main entrance, its chain and padlock long since broken. Let's just take a look around, make sure everything's okay, Reynolds replied, pushing the rusty door open with a creak that echoed through the empty building. The smell hit them first, dust and mildew mixed with something else Reynolds couldn't quite place. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating old machinery draped in cobwebs and floors covered in debris. And then they heard it, a faint sound that made them both freeze. A whimper, followed by what sounded like scratching. You hear that? Reynolds asked, and Daniels nodded, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. Hello, Reynolds called out, his deep voice bouncing off the walls. Police officers. Is someone there? We're here to help. No response came, but the sound continued, pulling them deeper into the building. The officers moved carefully, checking rooms as they went, communicating with hand signals and whispers. Let's split up, Reynolds suggested after they'd covered the main floor. You take the west side, I'll go east. Radio if you find anything. As Daniels disappeared around a corner, Reynolds felt an odd sensation in his chest, a tightness he couldn't explain. In all his years responding to strange calls, he'd never felt quite like this, like he was being pulled forward by an invisible thread. The crying sound grew slightly louder as he approached a hallway lined with what must have been offices once. His flashlight beam caught a flicker of movement under one door, a shadow passing. Reynolds placed his hand on the door handle, took a deep breath, and prepared himself for whatever waited on the other side. Reynolds turned the handle slowly, wincing at the slight squeak from the rusty hinges. The room was darker than the hallway, with plywood covering most of the window except for a small gap when moonlight slipped through. His flashlight beam swept across the empty space, an old desk pushed against one wall, broken chair in the corner, trash scattered around the floor. Nothing unusual for an abandoned building, but the sounds had definitely come from somewhere nearby. "Anyone in here?" he called out, softer this time. Something told him that whoever or whatever was making those noises wasn't a threat, but someone in need. A faint rustling came from behind the desk, followed by that same whimpering sound. Reynolds stepped forward carefully, mindful of the debris under his boots. As he rounded the corner of the desk, his flashlight beam fell on a pile of blankets and what looked like a backpack. The pile moved. Reynolds crouched down, keeping a safe distance. "Hey there," he said gently. "I'm Officer Reynolds with the Riverdale Police. I'm not here to cause any trouble, just checking if everything's okay." The blankets shifted again, and a face appeared. A young woman, her eyes squinting against the light. Her dark hair was matted to her forehead with sweat, and her face was pale, almost gray in the harsh beam of the flashlight. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help us." Us? Reynolds thought, and then he noticed the bundle tucked against her chest. As if sensing his question, the woman pulled back the thin blanket to reveal a tiny face, a baby, impossibly small, with eyes squeezed shut. "Oh my God," Reynolds breathed, immediately reaching for his radio. "Daniels, East Hallway, third door on the right, and call an ambulance. Now." The woman tried to sit up but fell back weakly. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought we'd be safe here until I figured something out." Reynolds noticed the empty water bottles, granola bar wrappers, and a small first aid kit opened on the floor beside her. She'd been trying to take care of herself and the baby with whatever supplies she had. "What's your name?" he asked, removing his jacket and gently placing it over her and the baby for extra warmth. "Lisa," she replied, her teeth chattering slightly. "And this is my son. He's 3 days old." 3 days. Reynolds felt his throat tighten. This young woman had given birth here, in this filthy abandoned building, all alone. He'd heard Daniel's footsteps pounding down the hallway, then his sharp intake of breath as he entered the room and saw the scene. "Ambulance is 4 minutes out," Daniels reported, looking shocked. "Lisa, how long have you been here?" Reynolds asked, kneeling beside her. "Almost 2 weeks," she said, her voice stronger now that help had arrived. "I left. I had to leave home." He said if I didn't. She trailed off, looking down at her baby. Reynolds nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. "You're safe now, both of you." The wail of sirens grew louder outside, and Daniels went to guide the paramedics in. Reynolds stayed with Lisa, asking gentle questions about how she was feeling, checking the baby's breathing, trying to keep her calm. "I was so scared no one would find us," Lisa admitted. "I tried to call out when I heard people walking by, but I was too weak after he was born." "Mrs. Chen across the street heard you," Reynolds told her. She knew something wasn't right. The paramedics arrived with a stretcher and medical bags, their practiced movements filling the room with a sense of urgency but also relief. As they checked Lisa's vitals and examined the baby, Reynolds stepped back, watching them work. One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes and quick hands, looked up at him. "Good thing you found them when you did, officer. They're both dehydrated, and Mom here might have an infection brewing." Reynolds nodded, unable to speak for a moment. As they prepared to transport Lisa and her baby, he gathered her few belongings into her backpack. A photo fell out, Lisa, looking healthier and smiling, standing next to an older woman with the same eyes. "That's my mom," Lisa said weakly from the stretcher. "She doesn't know about the baby. We haven't talked in a year." Reynolds carefully tucked the photo back into the bag. "Would you like us to contact her?" Lisa's eyes filled with tears again. "Could you? I think I need her now." As they wheeled mother and child out of the building that had been both their refuge and almost their tomb, Reynolds felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just another call. This was going to change more lives than just the 2 they'd saved tonight. The hospital corridors buzzed with the usual activity, nurses rushing between rooms, doctors reviewing charts, families waiting anxiously for news. Reynolds sat in the hard plastic chair outside the emergency room, his uniform rumpled from the long night. His shift had ended 4 hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Daniels had gone back to the station to file their report, but not before bringing Reynolds a cup of coffee that now sat cold and untouched beside him. "Officer Reynolds." He looked up to see a doctor standing there, her scrubs slightly wrinkled and dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she'd been on duty as long as he had. "How are they?" Reynolds asked, standing quickly. "The baby is doing remarkably well, considering the circumstances," the doctor said. "A bit underweight and slightly jaundiced, but his vitals are strong. Lisa, on the other hand," she hesitated. "She has a serious infection. We've started her on IV antibiotics, but she's very weak. Birth is traumatic enough in a hospital setting with medical care." "What she went through?" The doctor shook her head, unable to finish the thought. Reynolds rubbed his face with his hands. "Can I see them?" The doctor nodded. "Lisa's been asking for you, actually. Room 214. The walk to Lisa's room felt longer than it should have. Reynolds tried to prepare himself for what he might see, but nothing could quite ready him for the sight of the young woman in the hospital bed, looking impossibly small among the machines and tubes. Her baby boy was in a clear bassinet beside her, sleeping peacefully. "Officer," Lisa said, her voice stronger than it had been in the abandoned building but still fragile. "You came." "Of course," Reynolds replied, taking a seat in the chair next to her bed. "How are you feeling?" "Better now that I know he's okay," she said, glancing at her sleeping son. "The doctors say I'm lucky. Another day out there and—" She trailed off, then looked directly at Reynolds. "You saved our lives." Reynolds shook his head. "You saved your own lives by staying strong until help could find you. That took real courage." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "I was so scared. I didn't think anyone would hear us." "We got through to your mom," Reynolds said gently. "She's on her way. Should be here by morning." Lisa's hand flew to her mouth. "She's coming? Did you tell her about?" "We told her you were in the hospital and needed her. The rest is for you to share when you're ready." Lisa nodded, relief washing over her face. "Thank you." Reynolds glanced at the tiny baby. "Have you decided on a name for him?" A small smile touched Lisa's lips. "I was thinking of Thomas. It was my grandfather's name." "It's a good name," Reynolds agreed. "Strong." A knock at the door interrupted them. A woman from social services entered, carrying a folder and wearing a kind but professional expression. "Ms. Lisa Cooper. I'm Nancy from Family Services. I'd like to talk with you about your situation and see what support we can provide for you and your baby." Reynolds stood to leave, but Lisa reached out and caught his hand. "Would you stay? Please? I don't have anyone else right now." The social worker nodded her agreement, and Reynolds sat back down. For the next hour, he listened as Lisa told her story, how she'd left an abusive boyfriend when she found out she was pregnant, how she'd been living in her car until it broke down, how she'd been too afraid to go to a shelter for fear her ex would find her there. As Lisa spoke, Reynolds felt a growing heaviness in his chest. Not pity, but something deeper, a connection to this young woman's struggle that felt strangely personal. When she mentioned that her ex had threatened to hurt the baby if she didn't get rid of it, Reynolds clenched his fists under the table, thinking of his own sister from all those years ago. Nancy took notes and outlined resources, emergency housing, medical care for both mother and baby, legal help for a restraining order. Through it all, Lisa kept glancing at Reynolds, as if drawing strength from his steady presence. When the baby began to fuss, Lisa reached for him with practiced gentleness, cradling him against her chest. Thomas quieted immediately, recognizing his mother's heartbeat. "You're already a good mom," Reynolds said softly. "I want to be," Lisa whispered, her eyes never leaving her son's face. "He deserves better than what I had." In that moment, Reynolds made a silent promise to himself and to Lisa and Thomas that he would make sure they got it. Reynolds woke with a start, his neck stiff from sleeping in the hospital chair. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting stripes across the floor. He checked his watch, 6:42 a.m. He'd meant to leave after the social worker, but Lisa had fallen asleep mid-conversation, and somehow he couldn't bring himself to go. The door opened softly, and a nurse came in to check Lisa's vitals. She smiled at Reynolds. "You've been here all night," she whispered. Reynolds nodded, stretching his back. "Didn't plan to be." "You cops are something else," she said, making a note on Lisa's chart. "Her fever's down, by the way. That's a good sign." As the nurse left, Reynolds noticed Lisa watching him through half-open eyes. "Morning," he said. "You stayed," she replied, sounding surprised. Before Reynolds could answer, there was a commotion in the hallway. A woman's voice, pitched high with worry, asking for Lisa Cooper's room. Reynolds stood just as the door flew open. An older woman stood there, her graying hair escaping from a hasty ponytail, her eyes, the same shape and color as Lisa's, darting around the room wildly until they landed on her daughter. "Lisa." The word came out as both a question and a prayer. "Mom," Lisa whispered, her face crumpling. The woman rushed to the bed, gathering her daughter in her arms as carefully as she could around the IV lines. my baby," she kept saying, rocking slightly. Then she noticed the bassinet. "Oh my God, is that?" Lisa nodded. "Your grandson. His name is Thomas." Reynolds backed toward the door, feeling like an intruder on this family moment. As he reached for the handle, Lisa's mother turned to him. "Are you the officer who found them?" "Yes, ma'am." "James Reynolds." She released her daughter and crossed the room in 3 quick steps, pulling Reynolds into a fierce hug that caught him completely off guard. "Thank you," she said into his shoulder. "Thank you for finding my babies." When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. "I'm Dorothy Cooper, and I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Just doing my job, ma'am," Reynolds said, but they all knew it wasn't true. Officers didn't typically stay overnight with the people they helped. Dorothy turned back to her daughter, studying her face. "Why didn't you call me, Lisa? When that man hurt you? When you found out about the baby? When you had nowhere to go?" Lisa looked down at her hands. "You were so mad when I moved in with him. You said he was bad news and I didn't listen. I thought you wouldn't want me back." "Oh, honey." Dorothy sat on the edge of the bed. "I was mad because I was scared for you. But nothing could ever make me stop loving you. You're my daughter." Reynolds slipped out the door, giving them privacy for their reunion. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. Something about this case had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't explain. Or maybe he could, but wasn't ready to face it yet. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife, Karen. "Everything ok? You never came home." He typed back quickly. "All good. We'll explain later. Love you." As he headed for the elevator, his captain called. "Reynolds, heard you had quite a night. You filing the report today or taking some time?" "I'll come in," Reynolds replied. "But first I need to make a stop." An hour later, Reynolds stood outside a modest apartment building across town, knocking on a door. When it opened, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes appeared. "Martha," Reynolds said to his sister-in-law, "can we talk about Jenny?" Martha's face softened with old grief. "You haven't wanted to talk about her in years, Jim." "I know." Reynolds swallowed hard. "But last night I found a girl who reminded me so much of her. And I think I need to finally face what happened." Martha opened the door wider. "Come in. I've been waiting 20 years for you to say that." Reynolds stepped inside, ready to confront the past that had shaped his life, the sister he couldn't save, and the guilt he carried ever since. Maybe helping Lisa and little Thomas wasn't just about them. Maybe it was also about healing wounds he tried to ignore for far too long. Martha poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Reynolds at her small kitchen table. Family photos lined the walls, holidays, graduations, weddings. Pictures of the life his sister Jenny never got to have. "I kept everything," Martha said quietly, opening a drawer in the living room cabinet. She pulled out a worn photo album and placed it between them. Pictures, letters, even her diary. "Thought maybe someday you want to see them." Reynolds stared at the album, his throat tight. "I couldn't. After what happened, I just couldn't face it." "I know," Martha said. "You were only 22 yourself. Fresh out of the police academy, thinking you could save everyone." Reynolds opened the album slowly. The first photo showed Jenny at 16, her smile bright, her whole life ahead of her. A life that had ended 2 years later, alone in an apartment not much better than the abandoned factory where he found Lisa. "She called me that night," Reynolds said, the the words he'd held inside for decades finally spilling out. Said she was in trouble, that she needed help. But I was working a double shift. Told her I'd come in the morning. His voice cracked. By morning, she was gone. Martha reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Jim, you can't keep blaming yourself. Jenny made her choices. She was just a kid, scared and alone. Reynolds turned the page in the album. Jenny and Martha at the beach. Jenny at her high school graduation. When I found Lisa yesterday, all I could think was, what if someone had found Jenny in time? They sat in silence for a while, looking through the photos, remembering. Tell me about this girl you found, Martha finally said. As Reynolds described the abandoned factory, the tiny baby, the reunion with Lisa's mother, something shifted inside him. The knot of grief he carried for 23 years didn't disappear, but it loosened just a little. You know what Jenny would say if she were here? Martha asked with a sad smile. She'd say, Jimmy, stop being such a dumbass. You couldn't save me, but you saved them. That's what matters. Reynolds laughed despite himself. That did sound exactly like his sister. You're doing good work, Jim, Martha continued. And Jenny would be proud of the man you've become. I know I am. When Reynolds left Martha's apartment an hour later, he felt lighter somehow. Not healed, that would take more time, but like he'd taken a first step. He drove to the station to file his report, but halfway there, his phone rang. It was Karen, his wife. Hey, he answered. I'm headed to the station now. Should be home after. Jim, Karen interrupted. I just got off the phone with Dorothy Cooper. Reynolds frowned, pulling over to the side of the road. Lisa's mom. How did she get our number? She called the station, and they connected her to me. Jim, she told me everything about Lisa, the baby, how you stayed all night at the hospital. Karen's voice was thick with emotion. She asked if there was anything they could do to thank you. I told her about the nursery. The nursery. The room in their house that they'd painted yellow 5 years ago, filled with a crib and tiny clothes, waiting for a baby that never came. After 3 miscarriages, the doctors had told them to stop trying. Karen? Reynolds started, not sure what to say. They need help, Jim. A place to stay while Lisa gets back on her feet. Dorothy can't take them in, her apartment's too small, and she works 2 jobs. Karen paused. I told her they could use our nursery, just until they find something permanent. Reynolds felt his eyes burn. You did. Was that okay? I should have asked you first, but it just felt right. It's more than okay, he said, his voice rough with emotion. It's perfect. As he hung up, Reynolds looked out at the street before him. Ordinary people going about their day, unaware that lives were changing, hearts were healing, new beginnings were forming. His mind flashed to that tiny room in the abandoned factory, where he'd found Lisa and Thomas in the darkness. Sometimes, he thought, the most important calls weren't about catching bad guys. Sometimes they were about finding the good that was waiting to be discovered. 3 days later, Lisa sat in a wheelchair at the hospital entrance, little Thomas bundled in her arms. Reynolds stood beside her while Karen chatted with Dorothy, who was filling out the last of the discharge paperwork. Ready to go? Reynolds asked, noticing Lisa's nervous expression. She looked up at him, biting her lip. What if I can't do this? Be a good mom, I mean. Reynolds crouched down to her level. Lisa, you kept this little guy alive in an abandoned building with almost nothing. You're already doing it. She smiled weakly. But what about when I have to find a job? Or a place to live? Or when he starts school someday? One day at a time, Reynolds said gently. That's all any parent can do, and you won't be doing it alone. Dorothy joined them, putting a hand on her daughter's shoulder. The car's ready. Let's get you two home. Home. The word hung in the air like a question. Lisa would be staying at Reynolds' house for now, in the nursery that had waited empty for so long. The arrangement had come together quickly. Dorothy would visit daily while Karen worked from home, giving Lisa time to recover and bond with Thomas. The drive to the Reynolds house was quiet, everyone lost in their own thoughts. When they pulled into the driveway of the modest 2-story home, Lisa gasped. On the front porch stood at least a dozen people, some in police uniforms, others in regular clothes. A large banner hung across the garage. We'll see only a home laissez and take home mess. What's all this? Lisa asked, her eyes wide. Karen smiled. just a few people who wanted to welcome you." As Dorothy helped Lisa from the car, Reynolds took the baby. Officer Daniels approached first, holding a giant teddy bear. "Figured the little guy might need a buddy," he said with a grin. The police captain's wife brought a home-cooked meal big enough to feed them for days. Mrs. Chen, the neighbor who had heard Lisa's cries from the factory, had knitted a tiny blue blanket. One by one, people stepped forward with gifts, well wishes, and offers of help. Lisa stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed. "I don't understand," she whispered to Reynolds. "Why are all these people being so nice? They don't even know me." "That's just how this town is," Reynolds replied, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. It was how the town could be at its best moments, and something about Lisa's story had brought out that best in everyone. After the small crowd dispersed, Karen showed Lisa to the nursery. The yellow walls glowed in the afternoon sunlight, the crib was made up with fresh sheets, and a rocking chair sat in the corner by the window. "We can change anything you don't like," Karen said, watching Lisa's face anxiously. Lisa walked slowly around the room, touching the changing table, the tiny clothes in the dresser. "It's perfect," she said, her voice breaking. "I never had a room this nice, even as a kid." That evening, after everyone had eaten and Dorothy had gone back to her apartment with promises to return in the morning, Reynolds and Karen sat on their back porch. Through the baby monitor, they could hear Lisa singing softly to Thomas. "She has a nice voice," Karen commented, leaning her head on her husband's shoulder. Reynolds nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you for opening our home." Karen squeezed his hand. "After you told me about finding them, about your sister, I knew we had to help. Maybe this is why we never had our own baby. Maybe we were meant to help someone else's." Inside, the singing stopped. Reynolds pictured Lisa placing Thomas in the crib that had waited so long for a child to sleep in it. "How long do you think they'll stay?" Karen asked. "As long as they need to," Reynolds replied without hesitation. In the quiet of the evening, with stars beginning to appear overhead, Reynolds felt a peace he hadn't expected. For 23 years, he'd carried the weight of not being there when his sister needed him. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could help write a different ending for Lisa and Thomas. Their story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, Reynolds believed that sometimes broken things could be mended. Sometimes people lost in the dark could find their way home. 6 months passed in a blur of midnight feedings, first smiles, and small victories. The temporary arrangement had stretched on as Lisa finished her GED, then started online classes at the community college. Thomas grew from a fragile newborn into a chubby, laughing baby who reached for Reynolds the moment he came home from his shifts. Today was special. Lisa had received the keys to her new apartment. The women's shelter had connected her with a program for young mothers, offering subsidized housing while she continued her education. Reynolds drove her to see the place for the first time. Thomas babbled happily in his car seat, playing with a plastic set of toy keys. "Nervous?" Reynolds asked, glancing at Lisa. She nodded. "It's been so long since I had my own place. And never with a baby." The apartment was on the second floor of a well-kept building near the community college. 2 bedrooms, a small living room, and a kitchen with a window that looked out on a playground. "It's perfect," Lisa said, walking slowly through the rooms. "I can't believe this is really happening." Reynolds leaned against the doorframe, watching as she mapped out where furniture would go. Karen had spent weeks scouring thrift stores and garage sales, putting together a collection of necessities for Lisa's new home. "The moving truck with all your stuff comes tomorrow," Reynolds reminded her. "I've got 5 guys from the station ready to help carry everything up." Lisa turned to him, her eyes suddenly serious. "I don't know how to thank you. You and Karen, you didn't just save my life. You showed me what a real family looks like." Reynolds felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the mix of emotions that had become so common these past months. "You did the hard part," he said. "We just gave you a safe place to do it." Later that afternoon, they returned to Reynolds' house where Karen and Dorothy had organized a small goodbye party. A cake sat on the kitchen table with "Congratulations, Lisa" and Thomas written in blue icing. "It's not really goodbye," Karen insisted, bouncing Thomas on her hip. "You'll still bring this little man for visits, right?" Lisa hugged her. Just try to keep us away." As they ate cake, Dorothy pulled out a small gift bag. "I know we already gave you the practical stuff for the apartment," she said, "but I wanted you to have something special too." Inside was a framed photograph of 4 generations: Dorothy's mother, Dorothy, Lisa, and little Thomas, taken during a visit to the nursing home last month. "So you never forget where you come from," Dorothy said, "and where you're going." Lisa wiped away tears. "It's beautiful, Mom." That evening, after the party had ended and Lisa had gone upstairs to pack the last of her things, Reynolds sat with Karen on the porch swing, just as they had done that first night 6 months ago. "It's going to be quiet around here," Karen said softly. Reynolds nodded. "Too quiet." They sat in silence for a moment, the swing creaking gently beneath them. Then Karen turned to him, a nervous smile on her face. "What would you think about making some noise of our own?" she asked. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I called the adoption agency today," Karen said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "They have a sibling group, a 4-year-old boy and his 2-year-old sister. They need a home, Jim, a permanent one." Reynolds felt his heart skip. After years of heartbreak, they'd stopped talking about children. The nursery had become a reminder of what couldn't be until Lisa and Thomas had filled it with life again. "Are you sure?" he asked. Karen nodded. "Watching you with Thomas these past months, I've never been more sure of anything. We have so much love to give. Why keep it to ourselves?" Reynolds pulled her close. "When can we meet them?" 3 days later, Reynolds stood in the hallway of the children's home, watching through a window as Karen sat on the floor between 2 small children. The boy was showing her his toy truck, while the little girl leaned shyly against her arm. His phone buzzed with a text. It was from Lisa, with a photo of Thomas in his new room, surrounded by the toys and books the Reynolds had given him. "First night in our new place. He keeps looking for you guys. See you Sunday for dinner?" Reynolds smiled and typed back, "We'll be there. And we might have some news to share." As he looked back at Karen and the children, Reynolds thought about that night 6 months ago, when a mysterious noise had led him to an abandoned building. He couldn't have known then how answering that call would change so many lives, including his own. Sometimes the best endings were really just new beginnings in disguise.